Okay, hello. So I'm back for one more of these videos about the Circle game, the game based on that circle of knowledge. And I had made 4 videos on it, and I mostly said everything, but I realized there was one thing that I kind of forgot to talk about or didn't mention, or figured I'd just keep this. It'll probably be a shorter one. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about these basic character classes around the outside. So once I had made the chart, or along the way, I was kind of saying to myself, well, where do typical things that you're used to seeing in role-playing games, where do the roles go, or where do the character classes fit in this system that I made? So if you were just to map stuff that you're familiar with to this, kind of roughly where would they go? And I was curious to see if I would see things grouped together, or if they would be all over the place, and I feel like most of these, I've shuffled these around so many times, but I feel like most of them are, 90% right or something. Maybe they're not an exact fit, but they're mostly representative of where they go. And I want to talk about that a little bit, and just some of the other special considerations or things I do with like how I think about some of these classes and why they're in the position where they are. You could, of course, move them if you wanted, or if you feel they fit better somewhere else. And over time, again, sometimes I shuffle them. If you look at the previous incarnations, you'll see where they've all moved from over time. But there are a few interesting things that happened when I started placing characters on. So, something basic was like I knew mages had to go near intelligence, and I'll talk about these different mages in a second. But I knew mages had to go near intelligence, and warriors. And if you watch one of my other videos, in this system, typically a warrior is often associated with strength, but you'll see warriors over here and strength is up here. In this system, a warrior is more like about the attack and its agility and stamina, versus your heavy tanks and just your hard defender would be like a paladin or a warden, and they were more about strength. But I knew warrior had to be something with like the physical traits, so that started to put things like that over here, and so forth and so on. You start to label these. So then let's go around some of these outside words. So a warrior is a more specific, for example, a warrior is a more specific type of just a fighter. Fighter's even more of a general word, I guess, or it was to me. And so a warrior is like a fighter. Excuse me. So, that's why fighter is out here. But maybe I don't want to quite start in this corner. I think I almost want to start up here, so just give me a second to kind of collect my thoughts, because again, I'm doing this on the fly. Some other obvious ones were like, okay, part of this section over here was designed with the shapeshifters in mind. And, druid, I'm thinking, in this sense, I'm thinking of kind of like a typical WoW, World of Warcraft druid in a sense. They can shapeshift. They're kind of an omni character. They do a little bit of everything. Polymorph is over here, or you could think of like Odo from Star Trek. And so I knew that like polymorph and druid had to go near shifter. An alchemist is over here because that's the alchemy part of the circle. And it has to do with the transitions of all those elements and being able to switch between everything and kind of being a jack of all trades. And an elementalist is obviously, as we're getting more towards that chemistry side of things, you're getting into that sense of like somebody who controls the periodic table, or the elements, if you will. Now, a shaman is, and I forget what it was in WoW. It was like an agility character or strength and agility, but I felt that shaman was really connected to the earth, and it's similar to a druid, and it's similar to a shapeshifter, or another example again in WoW, the shamans could transform into wolves and things, and so they can shift. And so that's the reason that a shaman is over here. And they're kind of like a guardian and a jack of all trades. The shamans in that game could do a little bit of everything. They had some range, they had some melee. But they were that omnid, that jack of all trades type of thing. And they were earthy. Shamans tend to be earthy. You could make an argument that they're fire-based or spirit-based too, and I'll get into that in a minute. But you'll see once I go through these that there's a general trend and then why they end up over here. And I was just trying to fit in other random characters that I could think of from different systems or just anything that you could think of. Like old Final Fantasy games had a character called a Warden. Wardens are kind of like a guardian or a protector and are similar to a paladin. So now you're getting into like your heavy tanks over here. It's like your Warden, your Paladin, your Dark Knight or Knight. They're all kind of tanky, guardian type characters that are based off of strength and stamina. So that's why you see them over here. But then you get to something a little bit more agile as you're moving that way. You're moving towards Samurai and Monk. Monks are typically characters that are like life-based or have to do with, trading life for force or stamina. Yet they're similar to a samurai in one sense. So you're going around towards more and more like a ninja type character, or something that's a blade in it or sword type character. But they're still like a fighter. So then you go around, Beastmaster makes sense here because it's kind of like an agility character and it controls the animals. And this is the animal part of the circle and it's a fighter. It's it's usually a character that's physical based. A Dragoon was a character that, jumps with a pike or a spear and it's agility based. Now you're getting to something that's more speed. I said in this area here, other words before it was poise were words like speed and stealth and charm. And so your ninja's getting to be something that's more like a rogue or a thief or an assassin. So you see those start to come in over here on that rogue / as we approach rogue and tactician and the humans. You'll see things like thief and assassin. I'm going to stop and go back around this way and come back around. So the mages, so the hard casters or your heavy casters, if you will, are things like warlocks and wizards, and they're more over here towards wisdom and more of like a pure sorcerer. Whereas a mage is just a mage. So here you see all the different mages. And what do I mean by black, colored, and white? So it depends on which systems you're familiar with, but like obviously a black mage is usually all your attack magic and things like fire and water or ice spells, or your dark magic, if you will. Whereas a white mage is like healing, or cure or restore or revive or cleanse or something like that. And in the old Final Fantasy games, colored mages, there was all these other mages like green and yellow mages and in the Final Fantasy Tactics, I think it was, or some of the other games. And they all had kind of special different abilities. They were like one, I forget which was which, but like one was like had to do with time and could control time. One of the mages was all like the status effects, things like perplex and confuse, so like that's somewhere between, it's like the ability mages versus like your white healing mages and your black attacking mages, and the colored ones are just all the other random abilities in between. But again, that kind of fits with the, this whole region over here goes from elements into like subatomics and controlling things, in the quantum. And so that kind of fits in that area. And then you get more towards your heavy casters. A character like a summoner is a sorcerer. Or at one point I used to call this area sayers, because they're doing spells and they're casting things and they're reading incantations and summoning creatures by, things like that. So then you get towards a wizard. You'll notice that this section gets a little darker over here even, like warlocks and necromancers, and those are typically things that are thought of as like, death and dark energies. And that has to do with the fact that you get this cross here between life and light. And the life and light line kind of dictates things that are either making life or making death. So life and death can be thought of as over here, but it's also kind of over here in that immortal sense of like controlling life and death. And so you see kind of that, this goes back to some of that things I've talked in the other videos where it has to do with complements. If you were to attach these circles behind the circle, these sides, you'd see that there's kind of a complement thing happening across most of the circle. So here you get that death aspect of it. A genie is kind of an immortal type sorcerer character too. They're over in this area. And then I get to priest over here. A priest is a mystic. And I'll get into this too, the difference between a priest and a paladin and some of these other characters and a white mage. And I want to finish up going around this part here first before I get into that bit a little bit more. But I'll touch on it here and just say, like, some of it has to do with ranged or melee and whether you heal by like a spell, or if you're using holy magic, or if you're using like lay on hands, if you're a physical healer versus a magical healer. So I'll get into that in a minute here. But then your mystic characters are more just like a bard or a witch or an oracle or a mentalist. You know, in this area, you're getting those type of things, spirit stuff that's based off of spirits and the supernatural. And then in this section, the part we haven't covered down here, I guess coming back up this way again, you've got an assassin. You know, you go from a ninja, which is kind of like an assassin, to just a straight up assassin or a thief. The hunter and the archer are you know, you hunt with a bow. So those are characters that are kind of over here. And then a ranger or a sniper is becoming more like a specific type of hunter, you know. And then there's the Jedi, which is a mentalist or a tactician. And they're also like in that diplomacy area and the aliens area, you know, it's about that. And engineers, because of that steam and the human alien kind of craft part of the circle, and engineer is over here. So that's roughly why these characters are where they are around the outside of the circle. I want to check my time here. We're at 11 minutes. So, but once I did this and I had gotten a lot of these on here and they've shuffled over time, I noticed that there was an interesting pattern, and I don't know if you picked up on it at this point. You'll see that right along this line here, the line along flux and dust and the physics section, down to the sociology and poise and steam and island section, this diagonal here, I'm doing it a bit with my mouse, I hope you can see it. But you'll notice that, interestingly, it kind of splits the circle into ranged and melee. And by organizing them this way, you notice that all this stuff up here is the ranged characters. Which kind of makes sense, because you're up near air and fire and energy and the things that work via range, if you will. So you light and life. And so this is all ranged, and you'll notice that this here is most of your melee stuff. All this stuff is melee characters over here. So I wanted to point that out, because that was something that I didn't talk about the other day, is that this is your ranged characters up top, up to this upper left part, and the lower right and this side are all your melee characters. And of course, some are in between, like a battle mage, you know, sits right on the line, because he's like a knight or something that, you know, rides a horse maybe, or does some other stuff, and he carries an axe or some other things, but he casts spells too. Maybe he doesn't wear heaviest armor, maybe he wears like chain link or something, so he can still cast. So this is kind of a hybrid character, you know. Same way with like why druids are over here. Druids they're still in these two corner areas kind of bridge the ranged and melee. So druids, a lot of it is the bear or the tree or the cat. If I'm using WoW as an example, a lot of it's a melee character, but you know, the druid, the tree, and the owl, the boomkin were also casters. And they were polymorphs, and that's kind of getting into this. It can do both, a little bit of everything, ranged. So you'll see some stuff in this area that's both, and same way down here. You know, an archer's all ranged, but a hunter is mostly ranged, but maybe its pet, and its pet is melee, or it sets traps, or other things like that. So you kind of get this blend that starts here, where you go from, you know, engineer can be things with like turrets, and they act ranged, but they're a melee thing. So again, you see some, or you know, in a thief or an assassin, a lot of them are stabby characters with knives and blades, but they'll throw, like a ninja throws some shuriken or something, or a star, you know. So in general, again, it's not 100%, but it's 99% or something. Most of your melee's over here, and most of your ranged is over here. And of course, when you design a game or something, it's like, well, maybe all their primary abilities are melee over here, but you give them a secondary ability that gives them a little bit of range. And opposite over here, most of this stuff is ranged, but you give them a melee attack too, or something is like their secondary ability. And I've got, 5 or so minutes left to keep this under 20 minutes. Excuse me. So the other part of this that I wanted to mention is, so the melee and range thing was something I wanted to point out, kind of talk about where these characters were and why they were there. And the last thing I'd say is, again, 90% or so, if you think about the stats, I didn't want something where it was like every character had 8 stats. There's all these stats. You could say, okay, they've got a little bit of this and mostly this or something when you're talking about what's their primary stat. If you have do the characters in this game have just 1 stat or 2 stats or 3 stats, or how do you work that? You can choose however you want. In the game I made, the stats aren't as important on the board game part as it is just here to put them in for the design part so you know what you're working with. But you can say that each character's primary stat is what's near it. So the monk's primary stat is stamina, but this is what I wanted to get at a little bit. The characters that sit right on the stat, like a monk, that's mostly just a stamina character. And so if you had to say his primary stat, you'd say he's all stamina or something. Whereas like a warrior or a beastmaster or a fighter, they're more towards the middle here. Some character that you would deem would sit over here, it would have 2 primary stats, agility and stamina. And that the way that the game would handle it, or I had it in and out at different points, was that basically a monk would put 2 points in stamina, where a beastmaster or a fighter or something might put 1 in agility and 1 in stamina. So you just handle it that way, where the things that sit on it get like doubled up in the main stat, whereas the things that split 2 stats get 1 in each. So I wanted to point that out. And again, this isn't a 100% rule, but something else that I noticed over time when working with these, when I was thinking of things like, oh, what's the primary stats and what's the secondary stats? There's this interesting thing that kind of happens where the characters that split stats, like a warrior or a beastmaster fighter, something that sits in between 2 stats, their primary stat is kind of like the agility and stamina. But their secondary stat would be like branching out even further around the circle, like strength and poise. I mean, it makes sense for a warrior. That goes back to a warrior being a strength character in a lot of games, or he has to have some kind of battle poise to him and whatnot, and speed and things like that. So you'll notice that if it sits on here, like on one that splits, agility and stamina are the primary, and maybe if you had to say secondary, you'd branch out towards poise and strength as other stats that would be related to that class. And let's pick another one, for example, before I show you the other side of this coin. A thief would be poise and agility, but its secondary stats might be like spirit and stamina. Or another one that's sits on it, a wizard, for example, would be wisdom and intelligence, but its secondary stats would be spirit and flux. Okay, so that's for the ones that kind of split the stats. And again, for something right on a stat, its primary is just like twice that. Shaman is just a strength stat as its main. But this is where the other interesting thing happens. The ones that sit right on a stat, like strength, like the shaman, its secondary stat is often the complement. Like it kind of worked out, like if you think of a shaman, he's like a strength character with spirit. And so you might want to use, like strength for a shaman with its secondary stat being spirit. Or if you look like a black mage is mainly intelligence, but mages were kind of like they could get away from you and blink all over the place, and they're kind of agile. They have to be because they're glass cannons. They die otherwise. So I'm going to check my time. I got a minute or so, and I'll finish up in the next 2 or 3 minutes here. But the character, and again, this isn't a 100% rule, but I just noticed it as a trend. The characters that tend to that split stats for their primary stat tend to branch out as the ones next to that for their secondary stats, where characters that are solely on one stat for their primary stat often kind of work with having the complement as their secondary stat. A dragoon, which is mostly an agility character that jumps and hits things or uses a spear, is also kind of smart. It wasn't just like jumping into battle. They were more tactical a bit. And so intelligence kind of makes sense for a Dragoon's secondary stat. Or ninja. They're agile, but they're smart. You know, they're crafty. So, you know, again, giving a little bit of leeway here. There's things like that. It doesn't work like 100%, you know, a psionic mentalist is spirit. They're not as much a strength as their secondary stat. Okay. But it does work a bit. Or there's some tie to it there. Like I said, the Warlock is wisdom. Necromancer's wisdom. Now, is stamina right for their secondary stat? Kinda. It's still tying into this life force type thing or theme. But, you know, here's another good example. Hunter or Archer. Oh, that one's a bridge. No. Hunter Archer's poise. But, like, their secondary stat would be flux. Like, the ability to be adaptable. Hunters were kind of adaptable as a character. That they could do a little bit of everything and handle it somehow through their traps or their pets. You know, they could tank. They could do range damage. They could do melee damage. So, anyway, I think that mostly sums it up. I'm going to kind of end this. I don't think there's really too much else to that. But I want to just say why these were where they were. Say that the stats are kind of connected to them. And that the primary stat is usually the one or the two next to each other. And that you can think of the secondary stats as branching out from there. Or you can kind of think of it as the complement. It tends to work for a lot of the characters. Is there anything else? I thought there was maybe one more thing in my mind, but I guess I'm not thinking of it now. If there was anything else. Maybe it was something about a specific class. No, that's mostly it. If I have to think of anything else, I'll make another video. But we'll leave this one here so it doesn't get any longer. So, I don't think there's too much else to say about the game unless I remember something, or without showing you the actual game. And I think I'm going to make another video. There's another chart I haven't talked about yet. It's a chart of general correspondences, which I haven't used. And I might just make a video about that instead. So we'll see. But for now, here's another game video just to finish up talking about the character classes. I hope you enjoyed. Feel free to like and comment, and have a great day. Thanks for watching.